Right now, 21 miles of water are holding the entire global economy hostage. That's the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow choke point between Iran and Oman. And what's happening there today is not a drill, not a simulation, and not some distant geopolitical abstraction. Since February 28, 2026, shipping through one of the world's most critical maritime passages has been largely blocked after the United States and Israel launched an air war against Iran and assassinated Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. What followed wasn't chaos. It was a calculated, strategic Iranian response that every American needs to understand right now. Iran began laying naval mines in the strait. Ancient weapons, yes, but devastatingly effective in a narrow 21-mile-wide corridor that once carried roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of global liquefied natural gas. Think about that for a second. 1/5 of the planet's energy supply. Gone just like that. Oil supertanker costs in the Middle East climbed to their highest level on record, with major marine war risk providers scrapping cover for vessels operating in the Persian Gulf. And here's what the mainstream conversation keeps missing. Iran still retains more than 80% of its small boats and mine layers, and could feasibly lay hundreds of mines in that waterway. The United States has its destroyers in the strait. The USS Frankie Peterson and the USS Michael Murphy transited Hormuz, a deliberate, choreographed signal of defiance and resolve. But defiance doesn't sweep mines, and resolve doesn't reopen oil markets. What we are watching unfold is not simply a military standoff, it is a masterclass in asymmetric leverage, a nation with a fraction of America's military budget using $10,000 mines to paralyze trillion-dollar global energy markets. The real question isn't whether America can win a naval fight. The real question is at what cost and who actually pays it. So let's slow down and actually think through what is happening here, because I think most people, even people who follow the news every single day, are not grasping the full architecture of this crisis. They're seeing the headlines. They're reading about mines, about destroyers, about the ceasefire talks that collapse and then get extended and then collapse again. But what they're not seeing is the underlying logic. And if you don't understand the logic of what Iran is doing and why, you will never understand what comes next. And frankly, you'll never understand what it means for you, for your gas bill, for your grocery bill, for the economic current running underneath everything in your life right now. Let's start with the geography, because this is where it always begins. The Strait of Hormuz is a bottleneck. That's the only word for it. It's 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, forming a seaway passage between Iran and Oman, and its two unidirectional sea lanes carry around 20 million barrels of oil per day. 2 unidirectional lanes. Think about that. The entire global energy trade, one of the foundational pillars of modern civilization, depends on 2 lanes of water. That's it. And Iran sits on one side of those lanes, watching every tanker that goes by. For decades, Western strategic planners knew this was a vulnerability. They wrote reports about it, they held conferences about it, they built pipelines to partially bypass it, but they never truly solved it. And now the bill has come due, because here is what happened. On February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched an air war against Iran and assassinated Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Now, whatever you think about Khamenei, whatever you think about the morality or wisdom of that decision, you have to understand what it meant strategically. Iran had spent decades building a doctrine around the Strait of Hormuz. They called it their trump card, their leverage, the one asymmetric tool that could make an enemy with 10 times their military budget hesitate. And the moment American and Israeli bombs started falling on Iranian soil, and the moment the supreme leader was killed, Iran activated that doctrine instantly. Not reluctantly, not as a last resort, instantly, because this is what they had prepared for, this is the plan they had on the shelf. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps issued warnings forbidding passage through the strait, boarded and attacked merchant ships, and laid sea mines in the waters. And the world held its breath. Because here's something that the talking heads on television keep glossing over. A naval mine is not a sophisticated weapon. It's not a hypersonic missile. It's not a stealth drone. It's not some exotic piece of technology that only great powers possess. A naval mine is essentially a bomb attached to a float, anchored to the seafloor, waiting for something to bump into it. Iran has been stockpiling them for years. US officials estimated that Iran possesses between 2,000 and 6,000 naval mines. 2,000 to 6,000. Sitting in warehouses, waiting for exactly this moment. And you don't need to be a military genius to understand the math here. When you see the 21-mile-wide choke point with even a few dozen of those things, the psychological effect alone is enough to shut it down, because no shipping company is going to send a tanker carrying 2 million barrels of oil through a minefield. The liability alone would bankrupt them before the ship even left port. And this is the piece of the story I really want you to sit with, because it reveals something profound about how power actually works in the modern world. The narrative you've been sold, and I say this with all seriousness, is that America has the most powerful military on Earth, and therefore America controls the seas. And that's largely true in the open ocean. In the deep blue water, the US Navy is essentially unchallenged. Aircraft carrier strike groups roam the world's oceans with impunity. But the Strait of Hormuz is not the open ocean. It's a narrow, shallow, complex body of water surrounded by one of the most heavily armed coastlines on the planet, and in that environment the calculus changes completely. A country that cannot hope to contest American power on the high seas can absolutely make the Strait of Hormuz ungovernable for the price of a few thousand mines that cost tens of thousands of dollars each. That's the asymmetry. That's the leverage. A $10,000 mine can hold a $3 billion carrier strike group at bay by virtue of pure uncertainty. With the Strait of Hormuz effectively shut and oil flows down more than 90% from normal levels, the world is dealing with a supply hit of roughly 17.6 million barrels per day, approximately 17% of total global supply. Read that again. 17% of global oil supply. Gone. Analysts are calling this the largest energy supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Bigger than the Arab oil embargo of 1973. Bigger than the Gulf War. Bigger than anything the modern economy has ever faced. Gas prices hit $4 per gallon by March 31st, representing a surge of 30% as a direct result of the conflict, and those effects ripple outward in ways that are invisible on the surface but devastating underneath. Fertilizer prices, food prices, the cost of shipping every product you consume, the cost of plastics, the cost of heating your home, everything that runs on or depends on petroleum, which is to say everything, is being squeezed right now. Analysts project that global fertilizer prices could average 15 to 20% higher in the first half of 2026 if the crisis continues, and the price shock and shortage of fertilizer during the spring planting season could reduce the yields of corn in the US and potentially increase global food prices into 2027. Think about that the next time you're at the grocery store and wonder why the price of a dozen eggs or a pound of ground beef has climbed again. Now let's talk about what Iran actually did. Tactically, militarily, because this is where it gets genuinely fascinating and also genuinely alarming. Iran used decentralized forces during the conflict, with small boats leading the operations to mine the waterway and without a clear command chain on how to do it. Small boats, not submarines, not destroyers. Small boats operating under a decentralized structure, laying mines in the dead of night without coordinated record-keeping. And this tactical approach, which on the surface sounds almost improvised, almost amateurish, has produced a consequence that nobody planned for and nobody knows how to solve. Because here is the most extraordinary detail of this entire crisis, the detail that I think deserves far more attention than it has received. Iran lost track of all the naval mines it deployed. The country did not systematically track the placements of the mines, and in some cases deployed them in ways that they drifted away from their original positions. Iran mined a critical global waterway and then lost the mines. They can't find them all, and because they can't find them, they can't reopen the strait, even when they want to. Let that sink in for a moment. This is not a situation where Iran is holding the strait hostage and dangling the key in front of the world, waiting for the right offer. The situation is far more complex and far more dangerous than that. Iranian officials have indirectly acknowledged the difficulties, with Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi saying that the reopening of the strait will take place, and I want you to notice the phrasing here, taking into account technical constraints. Technical constraints. That's diplomatic language for, we laid mines and we can't find them all. And here is the hard truth that no one in Washington wants to say out loud. The United States cannot quickly fix this either. The Pentagon told Congress it could take 6 months to fully clear the Strait of Hormuz of mines deployed by the Iranian military. 6 months? Half a year. With the most powerful navy in human history and the most advanced mine hunting technology ever built, we're talking about 6 months. Because minesweeping is not a fast business, it is painstaking, dangerous, methodical work. You are searching for objects designed to be invisible, in murky water, in a confined space where your ships are also vulnerable to attack. The actual minesweeping work requires underwater drones, littoral combat ships equipped with mine countermeasures, packages, and helicopters. And mines come in many different forms, some of which may not be detected by or set off by US warships transiting the area. So when you hear that American destroyers sailed through the strait, understand what that actually demonstrated, that they can transit the strait. It does not mean the strait is clear. And here's something else that I find deeply telling about the nature of this conflict and about the strategic thinking, or lack thereof, that got us here. In the late 1980s, toward the end of the Iran-Iraq War, Iranian forces laid mines throughout the Persian Gulf, including in the Strait of Hormuz, as part of the so-called tanker war. This was not a new idea. This was not an innovation born out of the 2026 crisis. The Iranians have been doing this for 40 years. They have been rehearsing this moment for 40 years. And the strategic thinkers and the military planners and the foreign policy architects in Washington had 40 years to figure out how to prevent it or how to respond to it, and yet here we are. Which leads me to a question I want to put directly to you, because I think it's the right question to be asking. Was this conflict, with all of its staggering consequences for global energy markets and for ordinary Americans, and for the world's poorest people who depend on affordable food and fuel, was this conflict actually thought through? Was it carefully weighed? Or did it unfold according to a logic of momentum and of escalation that nobody truly controlled? I'm not saying I have that answer definitively. But the fact that we are now in a situation where the United States has its warships in the Strait of Hormuz, Iran has mines in the same waters, Trump has ordered the Navy to shoot and kill any Iranian boat found laying mines, writing on social media that there is to be no hesitation, and simultaneously ceasefire talks are being mediated by Pakistan in Islamabad, that's not a picture of a carefully managed strategy. That's a picture of a crisis that is barely being held together by improvised diplomacy and mutual exhaustion. Let's talk about that diplomacy, because it is genuinely surreal. On April 12th, J.D. Vance announced that the talks between the US and Iran had failed. And what followed was Trump declaring a naval blockade of Iranian ports, announcing that the US Navy would prevent ships from entering or exiting the strait and would intercept ships that had paid tolls to Iran. Iran, for its part, had already been charging a toll of its own. Iranian officials had floated a $2 million toll for all ships planning to cross through Iranian-controlled waters. So you now have a situation where the United States is blockading Iranian ports and Iran is charging tolls to let ships through the same waterway. A dual blockade, effectively. Two countries simultaneously strangling the same 21 miles of ocean and the world's energy supply caught in between. There are an estimated 500 to 700 large vessels stuck in the Persian Gulf, unable to exit. 500 to 700 ships, loaded with oil, loaded with goods, going nowhere. And then Iran offered a partial olive branch. On April 17th, Iran announced that the strait would be open to commercial shipping during the truce. Despite this, the US continued its blockade, and as a result, Iran reimposed restrictions. And this is the maddening cycle that this conflict has settled into. Iran opens, US keeps the blockade, Iran closes again. And with each turn of this cycle, more economic damage accumulates. More ships sit idle. More oil doesn't reach the markets that need it. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said that blockading Iranian ports is an act of war and that the US blockade and the seizure of an Iranian ship were ceasefire violations. Meanwhile, Trump was posting on Truth Social that Iran is collapsing financially. They want the Strait of Hormuz opened immediately, starving for cash, losing $500 million a day. Now, there's truth in that assessment, and there's also danger in it. Yes, Iran is under enormous economic pressure. Yes, the closure of Hormuz hurts Iran too, because a great deal of Iranian imports and exports flow through the same waterway. Yes, the sanctions and the blockade and the war damage have pushed Iran into a financial vice. But here's the thing about a country that is financially desperate and militarily cornered. It doesn't necessarily become rational. It doesn't necessarily make the deal you want it to make. Sometimes it doubles down. Sometimes it escalates. And Iran still has options. Iran still has the ability to fight back with mines, an unknown number of small boats that can carry missiles, surface drones, aerial drones, and land-based cruise missiles, as well as shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles that could target helicopters and fighter jets protecting ships in the water. The war damaged Iran's navy, yes. Iran still retains more than 80% of its small boats and mine layers. You cannot drone strike your way to a solution when the enemy's primary weapon is a $10,000 mine on a small boat that launches from a beach in the dark. And then there's the global dimension of this crisis, which is where things get truly complicated. In 2024, an estimated 84% of crude oil and condensate shipments through the strait were destined for Asian markets, with China receiving a third of its oil via the strait. China, a country that receives a third of its oil through a waterway that the United States and Iran are fighting over. A country that has its own strategic interests, its own relationships with Tehran, and its own calculations about how this crisis ends. On April 21st, during a call with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Chinese leader Xi Jinping said that the Strait of Hormuz should remain open to normal navigation, which is in the common interest of regional countries and the international community. That's a statement that sounds benign and diplomatic, but it carries weight. China is not neutral here. China needs that oil, and when China doesn't have oil, China has problems. And when China has problems, the global economy has problems. The interconnectedness of this crisis is something that most Americans have not yet begun to grapple with. Japan needs that oil, South Korea needs that oil, India needs that oil, and they need it not in abstract terms but in immediate physical, industrial terms that keep their economies running day to day. Military planners from more than 30 countries met at the Royal Air Force Base in the United Kingdom to put together a multinational mission to safeguard the Strait of Hormuz amid global concerns over oil and energy prices, and to coordinate responses that no single state could manage alone. 30 countries, half the developed world convening at a British airbase to figure out how to keep a 21-mile stretch of water open, navigable, and functioning under pressure. That's the scale of what we're dealing with, and it is not rhetorical exaggeration, it is operational reality. And it tells you something important, something structural. This is not simply a US-Iran bilateral conflict playing out in isolation. This is a crisis that has drawn in the entire architecture of global trade and global energy dependence, layer by layer, system by system, until there is almost no major industrial economy that is not exposed to it in some form. The IEA's executive director, Fatih Birol, described the disruption as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, affecting 11 million barrels of oil and 140 billion cubic meters of gas in daily global circulation, and that framing itself captures the scale of systemic shock that is now embedded in the situation. Let me also say something about the mines themselves, because I think people underestimate just how ingenious and just how terrifying these weapons actually are in a modern context, especially when compared to how they are often imagined in older strategic thinking. When you hear the word mine, many people think of World War II. They think of old black and white footage of floating spherical bombs with little spikes on them, drifting passively in open water. But modern naval mines are not primitive devices at all, and they are not simple in their logic or deployment. They come in multiple varieties, layered in sophistication, and designed for uncertainty rather than direct confrontation. Some sit on the seafloor and are triggered by the acoustic signature of a ship's propeller, waiting silently until the right pattern of noise passes overhead. Some are triggered by the magnetic signature of a ship's hull, responding not to contact but to presence. Some use pressure sensors that detect displacement in the water column itself, reacting to the passage of mass through space. Some can be programmed to let certain ships pass, ships with the wrong acoustic profile or not matching predefined parameters, and only arm themselves for specific targets, making the field itself selective and adaptive. And the deepest terror of a minefield is not actually the mines themselves in isolation. It's the uncertainty, the distributed ambiguity, the inability to know what is safe and what is not. It's the fact that you cannot see them, cannot map them with confidence in real time, cannot fully verify where danger begins and ends. Mine warfare is as much about psychology as it is about physical destruction, and often more so in its strategic effect. You just have to make people believe that mines are there, and the effect on shipping is the same as if you actually laid 1,000 of them across the channel. The perception of danger becomes the operational weapon itself. The closure doesn't require every mine to detonate, or even most of them to detonate. It requires every captain to wonder, consistently and without resolution, if this is the moment his ship hits one, and that sustained uncertainty becomes enough to alter behavior, reroute flows, and freeze movement across the system. And that's what Iran understood. That's what Iran has always understood about its strategic position. It does not need to defeat the United States Navy in a conventional naval battle. It never expected to. What it needed to do was make the Strait of Hormuz ungovernable for long enough to shift the political and diplomatic landscape. And whether you agree with that strategy or not, you have to acknowledge that it has worked, at least partially. Re-establishing freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz is widely seen as a substantial issue in the April talks, with Trump saying that the pause on U.S. strikes is subject to the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is now the central bargaining chip in negotiations over Iran's nuclear program, over sanctions relief, over the entire future shape of the Middle East. A few thousand mines dropped from small boats in the dark have forced the most powerful country on earth to make the reopening of one waterway the central condition of any peace agreement. That is not a small thing. And the ordinary American watching this, the person filling up their gas tank, the person noticing that their utility bill has climbed, the person wondering why the hamburger at the drive-thru costs what it used to cost for a steak dinner, that person is right to feel that something enormous is happening. Because something enormous is happening, analysts fear that another hard oil crisis is unfolding that will be very decisive to the global economy. The great post-World War II assumption that American power guaranteed the freedom of the seas and the stability of global energy markets is being tested in real time. And the test is being administered not by a peer competitor with a massive military, not by Russia or China, but by a country that has been sanctioned and pressured and isolated for decades, and that responded by building a strategy around the one thing it had that the world could not ignore, its geography. That is the Hormuz crisis stripped down to its bones. It is a story about geography and leverage and the limits of overwhelming military power. It is a story about what happens when the logic of escalation outruns the logic of strategy, and it is very far from over. The mines are still there. Some of them are still lost. Clearing the strait fully could take up to 6 months. The ceasefire is fragile. The diplomacy is stumbling. And the global economy is holding its breath, waiting to find out whether the people in rooms in Islamabad and Washington and Tehran can find a way to reopen 21 miles of water before the damage becomes permanent. That is what's at stake. And that is why this story matters to every single one of you watching this right now. Right now, 21 miles of water are holding the entire global economy hostage. That's the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow choke point between Iran and Oman. And what's happening there today is not a drill, not a simulation, and not some distant geopolitical abstraction. Since February 28, 2026, shipping through one of the world's most critical maritime passages has been largely blocked after the United States and Israel launched an air war against Iran and assassinated Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. What followed wasn't chaos. It was a calculated, strategic Iranian response that every American needs to understand right now.